Hannah's childhood was shaped by the cold dampness of the small cottage she called home, nestled on the edge of a fading industrial town in northern England. The roads were often empty, the sky permanently grey, and summer washed over London with golden light and restless possibility. Hannah, now accustomed to the shifting rhythms of her post-university life, felt both energized and uncertain. She had devoted most of the past year to amplifying the voices of others, collecting stories for her second book. The experience was transformative, forcing her to listen more deeply, not only to others' pain, but also to her own memories that echoed in their words. The project took her far beyond the familiar neighborhoods of her student years. She visited immigrant community centers in the East End, tiny libraries tucked above bustling markets, and anonymous council flats where brave souls welcomed her into their lives. In their kitchens over mugs of tea, people entrusted Hannah with their experiences, the ache of leaving home, the hope of new beginnings, the quiet dignity in ordinary survival. Each story was a mosaic tile, unique, intricate, incomplete on its own, but together forming unexpected patterns of resilience. At first, Hannah worried she would be a foreigner in these lives, but as she listened, she recognized a thread tying them all together, a hunger for meaning, a longing to be seen. Surrounded by voices so different from her own, she found a new companionship in the shared act of remembrance. Writing about them became a form of honoring their courage, a pact never to let their truths be buried beneath the distractions of daily life. Despite her outward activity, there were moments when loneliness crept back in, disguised as exhaustion or self-doubt. Some nights, after transcribing pages of interviews, she'd stare out her window at the city's sleepless lights, wondering if she was truly making a difference. It was her father, slowly reclaiming his place in her life, who reminded her of her impact. He called her after reading each early draft, sometimes offering gentle critiques, but always expressing amazement at the worlds she brought to life. One evening in late August, as a storm beat against her windows, Hannah finished the last chapter of her new book. She titled it Sanctuaries and Silences, not for the walls people built, but for the spaces where they found solace. Before she hit send on her final manuscript, she took a moment to reflect. Years before, she wrote to survive and to understand herself. Now she wrote to connect, to listen, and to bear witness. The submission was met with quiet anticipation. There were no guarantees of success, but for Hannah, that was no longer the measure. She closed her laptop, wrapped herself in a blanket, and felt, for the first time, a peaceful certainty. The person she had become was still growing, still searching, but finally whole enough to help others find their own voices. The air filled with the distant scent of coal from old factories that still clung to existence. Inside her home, the loneliness was more suffocating than the thick mist that hung outside. Her parents, Mary and Richard, were once loving, but as Hannah grew, so did the distance between them. Arguments behind closed doors became nightly rituals, and the once warm kitchen turned silent, only echoing the sound of the ticking clock on the wall. Hannah, with her dark curly hair and curious blue eyes, quickly learned not to expect bedtime stories or family dinners. Instead, she learned how to make herself toast and tea when she was hungry, sitting by the window and watching raindrops slide down the glass. At school, Hannah was quiet but observant. She never brought friends home, not wanting anyone to see the cracked walls or the way her parents ignored each other. She hid behind books, losing herself in stories of faraway lands and brave young heroines. Her love for reading became her shield and escape, giving her a sense of belonging the world around her failed to provide. When she was just 8 years old, a particularly harsh winter settled over the town. The single gas heater in their house broke down, and her parents, lost in their own troubles, barely noticed. It was Hannah who learned how to patch up the cracks in the window with newspapers, how to wear extra layers at night, and how to fill hot water bottles to keep herself warm. She became skilled at solving small problems, developing a quiet resilience that belied her age. One evening, her parents had a terrible argument that ended with her father storming out and her mother crying quietly in the next room. Hannah sat alone at the kitchen table, doing her homework by the yellow light of a single lamp. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that she was on her own in many ways. There was no one to make sure she did her homework or tuck her in at night. If things were going to be different for her, it would be because she made them so. Despite the hardships, Hannah refused to let her circumstances define her. She clung to her schoolwork, excelling in every subject despite the chaos at home. Teachers began to notice her diligence and quiet intelligence. The public library, just a few streets away, became her sanctuary. The smell of old paper and the comforting odor of the book stacks made her feel safe and invisible at the same time. Librarians, noticing her frequent visits, would sometimes slip her extra bookmarks or suggest new authors to explore. Sometimes, sitting curled up in a corner of the library, Hannah dreamed of a different life. A world where she would not have to be so strong or alone, a place where she could just be a kid. Until that time came, she promised herself she would never give up, no matter how tough things became. It was the beginning of a remarkable journey, the seeds of which were quietly taking root inside a small, determined girl. By the time Hannah turned 12, the storm inside her home had grown impossible to ignore. The arguments became louder, echoing off the thin cottage walls, sometimes stretching late into the night, their harsh words floating into Hannah's room where she lay curled under mismatched blankets. At school, she learned to hide the dark circles under her eyes and the numb ache in her heart. Her teachers remained impressed with her dedication, but only her English teacher seemed to truly see the sadness behind her sharp eyes. Then, one cold February morning, her mother left. She packed a small bag, kissed Hannah on the forehead with trembling lips, and walked out the door. There were no long explanations, just a quiet, "I'm sorry, Hannah. I can't do this anymore." Later, the neighbors would whisper about Mary and her disappearance, but no one checked in on the girl left behind. Hannah's father, Richard, responded by sinking deeper into silence. He started coming home late, sometimes not at all. The nights grew longer for Hannah. She learned not to wait for him for dinner, and often she would eat alone, a bowl of instant noodles or a slice of bread with butter. The money left on the kitchen counter was never much, but Hannah learned how to stretch it. She kept a careful list of groceries and planned simple meals, prioritizing what little nutrition she could. The loneliness was different now. In the beginning, she had clung to the hope that her mother might write, call, or even come back. But weeks passed without a word. Each night, Hannah would sit at her window, watching for headlights in the driveway, even though she knew deep down that no one was coming. Despite everything, she forced herself to keep getting up each morning, packing her school bag, and walking bravely past the houses that sometimes echoed with laughter or the smells of breakfast. She maintained her grades, driven not only by a need to escape but a determination to prove, to herself, to the world, or to no one in particular, that she would not be broken by her circumstances. She became resourceful in many ways. She patched her clothes when the seams frayed. If it was cold, she layered sweaters from charity shops. Whenever a bill came in the post, she kept them in a neat pile, marking due dates so nothing would get cut off. On weekends, she took odd jobs for neighbors, dog walking, leaf sweeping, babysitting, to earn a little extra cash. The small townsfolk grew to admire her resilience, even if they never really understood the fear and abandonment buried under her quiet exterior. One evening, after returning from her job at Mrs. Thompson's, Hannah found her father waiting for her, slumped at the table. For the first time, his shoulders looked fragile, weighed down by regret or exhaustion. Hannah couldn't tell. He managed a tired smile and slid a mug of tea across the table to her. In that moment, the silence between them felt less hostile, more like a shared understanding. They both knew, even if unspoken, that there would be no returning to the way things were. As she curled up with her tea that night, Hannah silently promised herself she would weather any storm. She was alone, but not defeated. Each hardship, each trial, was making her stronger. And though she missed love, warmth, and family, she carried a growing hope inside her, that one day, she would build a different life, a home filled not with broken words, but with peace. At 14, Hannah's life settled into a quiet, predictable pattern: school, small jobs, solitary dinners, and the evenings she cherished most, reading in the local library. As winter surrendered to spring, the world outside began to bloom, but for Hannah, change started quietly from within. It was her love of stories, of courageous characters overcoming impossible odds, that began to guide her out of the shadows. Everything changed the day Ms. Walker, her English teacher, handed back an essay. Written feedback trailed down the margin, far longer than Hannah had ever seen before. Ms. Walker smiled as she spoke softly, "Your words have power, Hannah. You have a gift." For the first time, someone had seen her heart behind the words, her hopes and scars woven into each sentence. Encouraged, Ms. Walker urged Hannah to enter an essay contest. A national competition neither of them expected to win, but both believed was worth trying. Hannah had her doubts. She wondered if anyone could truly care about the thoughts of a quiet girl from a broken home. But she poured herself into the story, writing late at night in her small, chilly room. Her essay spoke of forging strength in solitude, of survival and possibility. It was her life on paper, raw and unpolished. Weeks passed. Spring rains fell ceaselessly, and Hannah's nerves grew each day. Then, one May morning, Ms. Walker's eyes sparkled as she called Hannah to the staff room. "Third place, Hannah. Out of thousands," she said, her voice trembling with pride. "They want you at the ceremony in London." Stepping onto a train for the first time in her life, Hannah traveled with Ms. Walker to the big city. Her hands shook as she collected her award on stage, but behind the nerves was a rising tide of belief. Maybe she was capable of more than she had ever dared to dream. Returning home, Hannah felt the change within her. The library staff congratulated her with proud smiles, tucking aside a collection of classic novels for her as a gift. In her small town, people she barely knew began to greet her by name. But deeper than recognition from others was the newfound faith in herself. With Ms. Walker's steady encouragement, she threw herself into her studies, took on new writing projects, and began to dream about a future that extended far beyond the boundaries of her old life. Ms. Walker became much more than a teacher. She was a mentor, an anchor in Hannah's turbulent world. Their after-school meetings were filled with laughter, sometimes tears, and always stories. Hannah learned to trust the world a little, to share her voice, and to hope again. The darkness at home remained, but Hannah saw glimmers of light flickering in her path. A reminder that even in the unlikeliest places, hope can take root and begin to grow. By the time Hannah turned 16, the world around her was shifting. In the cramped kitchen where she once ate alone, new challenges took root. Challenges that required resilience and grit she didn't know she had. Her father, burdened by quiet regrets and financial hardship, lost his job at the local factory soon after Hannah's birthday. The small budget they had survived on shrank even further, and the tension in the house was no longer just emotional, it was a matter of survival. Hannah sat at the kitchen table one gray afternoon, bills spread in front of her like a daunting puzzle. She realized that if she didn't step up, they might lose their home. The fear was overwhelming, but just as before, Hannah refused to let fear paralyze her. Instead, she set about making a plan. The next day, she put on her neatest clothes and went door to door in town, asking about part-time work. Some turned her away kindly. Others, with a soft spot for the quiet, strong-willed girl, offered small jobs, cleaning, waiting tables, helping out at the old bakery on weekends. Eventually, she landed a steady position at a corner cafe, working evenings after school and long shifts on Saturdays. Balancing work and studies was exhausting. There were nights when Hannah nearly fell asleep over her textbooks, and mornings when her body ached from hours on her feet. Still, she persevered. Every paycheck, no matter how modest, felt like a step toward safety. She budgeted carefully, putting aside small amounts for emergencies, and used what was left for groceries, utilities, and school supplies. Despite the grind, school remained her sanctuary. Ms. Walker, ever her champion, ensured Hannah didn't slip behind. She encouraged her to take pride in her hard-won achievements and to apply for a university scholarship, a bold idea that filled Hannah with both excitement and dread. The prospect of leaving everything she had known, both good and bad, stirred a storm of emotions inside her. Around this time, her relationship with her father changed. Though he still retreated into long silences, he sometimes joined her at the kitchen table as she added up the month's expenses or planned out meals for the week. Together, they learned to communicate simple gratitude and small kindnesses, even if words were few. Hannah's dedication at the cafe didn't go unnoticed. The owner, Mrs. Blackwell, became yet another quiet mentor, teaching her not just how to work, but how to manage time, handle customers, and run a small business. These lessons, picked up on the job, became invaluable skills and confidence boosters. When university application season arrived, Hannah and Ms. Walker pored over forms and essays, searching for scholarships that offered even the thinnest chance. The process felt never-ending, but giving up was never an option. Months later, a thick envelope arrived in the post. Hannah opened it with trembling hands. She'd been awarded a full scholarship to a prestigious university in London, an opportunity that changed the trajectory of her life in an instant. It was more than just a ticket to education. It was proof that everything she had endured, every difficult decision, had meaning. She was not trapped by her past. She was breaking free. That night, as she shared the news with her father, there were no grand speeches, just a look of pride and a quiet, "I'm proud of you, love." And for Hannah, it was enough. Standing on the threshold of a new chapter, she knew the hardest battles had strengthened her spirit. She was ready to claim the future she had fought so hard to reach. The train bound for London thundered through green hills and grey towns, carrying Hannah further from everything she had ever known. She watched the landscape shift from familiar fields to sprawling suburbs, feeling a strange mix of freedom and sorrow tug at her chest. All her life, she had dreamed of escape and new beginnings, but now that it was real, the future felt daunting. Would she belong here, in a city so vast and alive, or would she always be that girl from a forgotten town, just barely holding herself together? When Hannah arrived for her first day at university, the city seemed to pulse with energy. Skyscrapers reached for the clouds, red double-decker buses swarmed the roads, and everywhere she looked, extraordinary people hurried toward ambitions she had never dared to imagine. Her dorm room was tiny but tidy, with a window that overlooked bustling streets and seemed, for the first time, to promise possibility. Yet, her first weeks were hard. Many of her classmates came from privileged homes, speaking confidently in seminars, discussing foreign vacations and elite schools. At first, Hannah felt painfully out of place, certain that someone would discover how little she truly belonged. She worried about her accent, her cheap clothes, and her lack of the easy confidence others had. But Hannah's old habits, watching, listening, working twice as hard as those around her, did not fail her. She discovered the university library, a labyrinth of books and study carols, and lost herself in the academic world. Writing essays late into the night, she poured her experiences into her work, drawing on a depth of feeling and understanding many of her peers could not match. When a literature professor praised her unique voice during class, Hannah's cheeks burned with pride. Little by little, she pushed herself to join writing societies and volunteer programs. She found others who understood what it meant to build something from nothing, to choose resilience and hope over anger at the past. By volunteering at a community center, helping low-income children with homework, she found comfort and friendship in giving back. Managing her finances was a constant challenge. Despite her scholarship, living in the city was expensive, and Hannah juggled part-time work at a cafe on weekends. Her days were packed, her energy stretched thin, but she refused to let exhaustion turn into resignation. Each small victory, each passing grade or new friend, felt like proof that she was, in fact, finding her place. Still, there were difficult nights. Sometimes, loneliness returned, and Hannah would sit by her dorm window, watching the lights flicker far below. She called home often, speaking quietly with her father, carefully editing out the hardest moments. She missed the old library, Ms. Walker's encouragement, and even the slow pace of her hometown. But now, when homesickness pressed in, Hannah reminded herself of the journey she had survived, how fiercely she had fought to get here. By the end of her first year, Hannah's world had begun to expand. She earned recognition for her essays, made friends who valued her story, and slowly created a life built on hard work, resilience, and new dreams. London was no longer just a city of strangers, it was becoming her home, and Hannah knew she would make the most of every opportunity, because she had earned it, every step of the way. By the time Hannah neared the end of her university years, her world was both richer and more complex than she could ever have imagined as a lonely girl in a northern town. Now 24, she had weathered countless exams, late-night study sessions, and the never-ending financial pressures that came with life in a metropolis. Yet, the challenges had only sharpened her resolve. One of the defining moments of her academic career came in her final year, when she submitted her senior thesis, a work that combined literary analysis with her own powerful memoirs. Her professors were moved by her honesty and depth, and the piece garnered attention beyond the university. An editor from a small publishing house contacted her, intrigued by the raw clarity with which Hannah wrote about survival, loneliness, and hope. At first, Hannah hesitated, unsure whether she wanted to lay H. Publication day arrived with an unexpected hush. Hannah sat cross-legged on her living room floor, a small stack of advance copies next to her, as sunlight crept across the hardwood. Gone this time were the nerves and self-doubt that had colored her first book release. Instead, she felt a quiet pride in the journey she and her contributors had made together. Messages trickled in as the morning went on. The first was from a woman named Amina, whose chapter recounted her first nights in London after fleeing her homeland. "You made me feel heard, not just seen," the message read. Then a young man Hannah remembered from a youth shelter wrote, "Reading my own words, I believe I can keep going." Each note reinforced the sense that her purpose reached beyond storytelling. She was helping others recognize the strength in their own lives. In the days that followed, sanctuaries and silences gathered momentum in unexpected ways. Teachers asked to use it in classrooms, hoping to teach empathy through real stories. A community organizer invited Hannah to open a local story-sharing festival. Her father attended the event, sitting in the front row and holding her book in his lap, his eyes shining with pride. But the true meaning of success revealed itself not in reviews or interviews, but in small, private moments. At a cafe, a shy teenager quietly slid Hannah a napkin with, "Thank you for writing about people like us," scrawled in blue ink. In a rainy park, an older woman stopped her mid-stride and said, "I found myself in your pages." Each encounter stitched a new patch into the quilt of Hannah's world. She understood now that her work, her life, would always be unfinished, always expanding to include more stories, more voices. Creation, she realized, was not just personal healing, but a bridge toward collective hope and understanding. As autumn winds curled around the city, Hannah walked by the Thames once more. The water glimmered with possibility. She thought of the lonely girl she had been, and the many others still out there, waiting perhaps for someone to tell them their story mattered. Hannah carried in her a hope both sturdy and luminous, aware now that every voice, even her own, was worth both sharing and cherishing. And with each step forward, she promised herself she would listen, always our soul bare to the world. But then she remembered all the silent, struggling girls she'd seen in library corners, or serving coffee in small-town cafes, and decided she owed it to them, and to herself, never to hide her truth. The process of turning her thesis into her first book was both exhilarating and frightening. Sitting for hours at her tiny desk in student housing, she revised, expanded, and polished chapter after chapter. She wove her childhood memories together with her reflections on literature and the power of stories to rescue, mending even her own wounds through the act of creation. When the book was finally published, the response was immediate and profound. Reviews praised her piercing honesty and remarkable voice. Hannah was invited to literary festivals and local radio programs, and for the first time, she stepped onto stages with confidence, sharing her journey. The royalties from her book were modest by bestseller standards but felt enormous to Hannah, who had learned to survive on so little for so long. Determined to pay it forward, she donated a portion of her earnings to local charities supporting children from fractured families, knowing even a small amount could make a difference. She visited schools and youth centers, volunteering to lead writing workshops. She believed that no one's story deserved to be silenced, especially those without power or privilege. Meanwhile, Hannah's life outside her writing blossomed. She built deep friendships with people who valued her history and heart. Her relationship with her father, once made awkward by pain and distance, had found new ground. He read her book with quiet pride, phoning her after each chapter to share memories or ask questions. For the first time, they talked openly about her childhood and his regrets. Healing, though slow, was real. In the evenings, after a day of writing or teaching, Hannah sometimes walked along the Thames, the city lights reflecting on the water. The ache of loneliness that once defined her had faded, replaced by a growing sense of belonging, not just to a place, but to herself, her past, and all the people she might yet help through her example. She knew there were still struggles and setbacks ahead. But Hannah had rebuilt her life from almost nothing. She carried within her the certainty that hope, like a tiny seed, could survive in even the hardest soil.